Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, we're going to talk about BoJack, specifically season 4 of BoJack. I actually saw this kind of a while ago. This was somewhat convenient, rather interesting. It was not very long after Claudia and I had our miscarriage incident, and BoJack season 4. It features a couple of different things, and one of the things that it features is a miscarriage plotline with Princess Caroline. She hooks up with a mouse and then tries to have a baby with this mouse, and it turns out she just has a difficult time conceiving. Now, BoJack's been out for a while. A lot of BoJack's actually really good. It's really well written. It's really interesting to watch. The voice acting is good. Like, the characters have a lot of charisma, and I generally like everybody in it. There are characters who I'm sad left the show. Like, I really liked the owl girl. I can't remember what her name is, but I really liked her. I thought that she was really kind of a fun character, and it's sad that she left. Spoilers, by the way. I'm going to spoil things about BoJack. If you don't want things to be spoiled, then you should not watch this video. But anyway, though, yes, she left BoJack at the end of all of that, and yeah. But what I wanted to do, though, I want to talk about season 4 because it's interesting. What I think that we might be seeing with BoJack is season 4 might be the last good season that we have. There's a little bit of writing on the wall that potentially things are about to get really stupid, and I'll go into why. In the past, BoJack has been mostly focused on BoJack's personal issues, like his failure as a human being, his depression, and stuff like that. And season 4 continues to kind of be about that, and it still does a good job. It has a lot of interesting moments and a lot of things that I really liked, but it got to a point of bluntness, and it was a little bit preachy this time around, this particular season, and so I'll kind of explain where it goes. In the last season, BoJack, our main character, BoJack, was I think about to kill himself on the road or something like that, but then he stops and he sees a bunch of horses and he's thinking oh well, I'll go join them, and so he's kind of gone when the season starts up, and we're focused on the side characters, Mr. Peanut Butter and his wife Diane. Diane is actually a main character. I guess Peanut Butter's a main character too, but they're kind of like side characters to BoJack, who appear very frequently, but they're not really the main focus of the camera. But this time around, for this season, Mr. Peanut Butter and Diane are featured very prominently. They stay main characters for quite a lot of the deal. And Mr. Peanut Butter decides that he's going to run for governor. So he doesn't really understand the whole governorship thing. He does his campaign in a legal way initially, but it sort of falls through. So then he decides well, I can still become governor. And so what he does then is he declares the mayor Woodchuck Coodchuck, who I think is a Obama allegory, but who comes across, he's really charismatic and really kind of funny. He plays this really good straight man with this whole thing. Mr. Peanut Butter is sort of his dumb guy, and the governor is the straight man. So it makes a good comedic duo, which is really fun. I really like the two of them when they were interacting and doing things, because all these horrible things keep happening to Woodchuck Coodchuck, but he just stays on the level the entire time, stiff upper lip. Here I go, this is a setback, but we'll move forward. No matter what happens to him, he just continues to he stays focused, and he's just this genuine, very genuine type of character, and no one appreciates him. So, yes, Coodchuck Woodchuck, he winds up saying something, I can't remember what it is, but Mr. Peanut Butter is oh, I challenge you to a ski race for governor, and Woodchuck Coodchuck, he goes, I wouldn't do that unless such and such happened. And so it winds up being that these conditions are met, and I can't remember what exactly it is, but he agrees to go on this skiing competition with Mr. Peanut Butter. But it turns out that Woodchuck Coodchuck is he's a really highly skilled skier, and Mr. Peanut Butter has never been skiing in his life. So for whatever reason, just by sheer luck, because this is how this works, Todd winds up winning the race. And then Todd declares he doesn't want to be a mayor, so it turns out they have to have another race, an actual political race, to get Woodchuck Coodchuck reelected. And this whole thing kind of then it gets in Mr. Peanut Butter starts campaigning because he wants to be governor, and he comes out in favor of fracking. And this is where season 4 took a turn for the stupid. It wasn't the worst thing that it did, but they got into fracking. Mr. Peanut Butter, they're just Mr. Peanut Butter, how do you feel about fracking? And Mr. Peanut Butter didn't know how he felt about fracking, so he was just I'm for it, because he's a positive guy. And I can't remember if there was some kind of circumstance. I think maybe there was something like Todd did something, or there was some kind of joke. But you could believe that Mr. Peanut Butter would do that on his own, because he's like a golden retriever. He's for everything. He's a happy, positive guy. So he's like, yeah, I'm totally for fracking. And Diane is just like incredibly liberal. She's very left wing. She's like the strong feminist or whatever. She's anti-fracking. And as they're going along fine up until this point. But they started to do this thing, and I remember like Family Guy did this, where Family Guy ran for a couple of seasons, and for a while they were kind of irreverent, and they made like comedy about politics and current events and things like that, like about pop culture, but they weren't really like, I don't know if they were necessarily condescending, or if they were kind of like not taking themselves too seriously. But you had like Brian in Family Guy, who was kind of the mouthpiece for Seth MacFarlane, started to get more and more uppity, and the show started to get like more and more like, well, Brian is right, like Brian has this liberal opinion, but he's just totally right about everything. Like Brian's the only one who's smart, and his flaw is that he's too smart. It's kind of like that sort of thing. So we kind of got into this weirdness with Diane just a little bit. It's not as bad as like Family Guy was, but Diane was like, no, fracking is terrible. And then the show kind of went on to demonstrate like all these ways that fracking are terrible. And it led into some stuff that was a lot of fun. So it's not entirely bad. Like you can excuse it because it led into some good things. But they did some stuff that was like a little weird. Like Diane was like, yeah, fracking is terrible. And then she went to go turn on her sink, and the sink burst into flame. And this was the thing that was really popular back when fracking was like at the height of controversy. It's actually not anymore. This is one of the problems with making a cartoon. And, like you've got your production cycle, and like, maybe next year you get your cartoon. But because oil prices have fallen, fracking is no longer the hot issue that it was. Like, I mean, it's still important, but fracking has been around for a long time. Like, it's been around since I think like the 80s or whatever. And so there's, it's not like it's a brand new kind of thing that people are just doing. It's just that fracking became more viable as oil prices went up. And then they started talking a lot more about like, well, if we start doing a lot of fracking, like what's going to happen? And what you really get into, there are environmental concerns with fracking. For example, there's emission concerns because a lot of the equipment that they use to do fracking will emit like harmful ozone chemicals and things like that. So there are, the EPA is concerned about regulating emissions from the fracking industry. They're also concerned about storage safety and things like that, because they have problems with sometimes a storage tank will burst, and that causes a lot of contamination. Like there's problems there. They do worry about groundwater contamination, but they worry more about benzene is the concern, because benzene is like a chemical that they use in a lot of different reactions. It's a highly reactive chemical. It's also carcinogen. So if it gets into your drinking water, the problem with benzene is that it's not going to be immediately noticeable. It's going to cause cancer in maybe in people, or maybe in wildlife that relies on the drinking water. It's hard to say. The environmental impact would be kind of bad. It's controversial. They're not really sure exactly how, when fracking follows the rules and it's well regulated, they're not exactly sure if it has this severe impact. Sometimes they find cases of fracking companies that kind of violate these rules, like there's things they're supposed to do, and sometimes they don't necessarily do them, and this might lead to contamination, and so on and so on. Like many things in politics, it's a complex sort of thing. The whole question of how do we regulate fracking is much higher elevated than what most people understood about it. The overwhelming majority of people who got into fracking, who cared about fracking when it was popular on the internet, knew nothing about fracking. And one of the things that people knew nothing about was the burning sink thing. And so sinks methane in the water, in your drinking water, is actually a thing that can happen in a couple of different ways. One way that it can happen is if you don't dig your wells appropriately. I believe if they're dug too shallow, then the water can become stagnant, and you can develop what's a bacterial infestation known as methanococcus. And methanococcus, it's an anaerobic bacteria. It sits at the bottom of stagnant water, and it actually produces methane, hence the name methanococcus. And methanococcus is famous for producing those swamp gas, those little orbs of light that burst in swamps, and people mistake them for alien activity or whatever. Swamp gas, you get that. That's a naturally occurring source of methane if your water becomes infected. In other cases, they found that one guy who claimed that he had methane in his water from fracking, and it had apparently been in there for a very long time. What had happened happened in that case is they drilled their well through an area of stone that actually contained methane naturally, and so it wound up being that because they had to drill through this methane-containing stone, they had a bunch of methane in their drinking water. This wasn't because of fracking. This was just because of it was just a naturally occurring pocket of methane. Not anybody's fault necessarily. Some of the cases, especially the ones that came up in these documentaries that got passed around online a lot, some of them were outright fraud. Like when they went and they investigated these people who said they had methane in the water, they found that people had done things like hooked up their garden hoses to like methane lines, specifically so that the hose would produce methane when you turned it on. So, some cases were just outright lies and fabrications. So BoJack did this thing where they were like, oh, fracking is really bad, but they didn't actually like explain. They didn't really express any awareness of like how fracking works or what would be bad about it. And then like the things that they demonstrated is like, oh, fracking is bad. It was kind of like the internet hoax and fraud type of things, like the burning sink and whatever. So it was a little bit weird, but it's politics, and politics is complicated, and it wouldn't have made a very good cartoon for them to get into, be like, this carcinogen, maybe in like 20 years we're going to develop cancer or whatever. It would be hard to write about that, so you can kind of understand and excuse why they would do that in this case. I don't know why they hinged on fracking, why they got hooked on fracking, but my guess is because what winds up happening is because of the fracking, like they say, like, oh, if fracking is so safe, Mr. Peanut Butter, why don't you allow people to do fracking underneath your house? And Mr. Peanut Butter goes, okay, yeah, sure, just come and do fracking underneath my house. And so the fracking causes his house to fall into a sinkhole, which it turns out is also infested by like giant ants. But that's aside from the fact. The fracking is what caused his house to fall into this sinkhole. So then they go into this like funny tribal thing, which I really enjoyed. Like I really like this, and that's why I say like you kind of forgive because. Obviously you can't win a race for governor by actually challenging the governor to a literal race down a mountainside. So, I guess you can kind of excuse the whole fracking thing. You say like, all right, fracking doesn't really work like this. I mean, the average person doesn't know how fracking works, so this will probably make people think dumb things. But I could forgive someone for doing this, and it led to this funny like tribal thing, where everyone is there for a fundraiser for Mr. Peanut Butter, but then like they all turn on each other and they're like, we have to cannibalize people, and so Mayor Woodchuck Coodchuck actually comes down to rescue everyone. He's a woodchuck, so he digs this hole and he's like, I've dug a tunnel, everyone. But then through everybody's stupidity, they collapse the tunnel on Woodchuck Coodchuck's hands. And then they start going through this thing where, like Governor Woodchuck, he comes up with this good organizational plan. He's like, yeah, we'll ration the water, and it'll take about this long to do this. And, because of all the political instability lately, it's going to take rescue teams a little while. But I estimate that if we do this, we should be fine for this amount of time. But then they wind up holding an election in the House, and through the power of democracy, managed to overthrow Woodchuck Coodchuck. And they put Mr. Peanut Butter in charge, who then declares that everyone can eat whatever they want because that was what everyone wanted to hear, so that's what everybody does, and so they don't have like a plan anymore. He just basically undermines everything. And so then they run out of food and they all agree to eat Mr. Peanut Butter, and that's when the ants show up. And because Princess Caroline negotiates with them, and the ants decide to rescue the house. So that whole scene, like I said, the fracking thing was weird, and it wouldn't have stood out if that was the only thing that they did. Because occasionally BoJack does make commentary on social issues. Like, they had this whole thing in the previous season where Todd opened up this company, and it was like, yeah, it's a taxi service for women to make women feel like they're in a safe space. Like, we only have women drivers because, women are never known to be bad taxi drivers. Women are not known to be bad drivers, and so women feel safer driving with taxi drivers. A little sexism joke. But anyway, so it wound up just becoming this whole thing where they were like, oh, it turns out men really like the idea of women drivers, and they really want, like, sexy women drivers. So what if we hire sexy women drivers and make them wear sexy clothes, and then have them pick up only men? And it kind of becomes this sort of thing, and it was kind of a commentary, but you could see that happening, and it was sort of funny watching them evolve into basically like sexy chauffeurs for men or whatever, away from like this thing only for women. So there was the comedic element, and it was good, and they had their social commentary. but it all kind of like flowed together, so it didn't feel like it didn't feel like it stuck out like a sore thumb, really. The fracking thing just felt like the writers didn't know what fracking was, and so they were just kind of like, yeah, fracking, I don't know, that's the point. The point is we want to sink the house. So yeah, so then they move on, and you get into this stuff with like Princess Caroline, and Princess Caroline is trying to have this baby, and this one was actually very true. I didn't feel like they got anything wrong with this whole Princess Caroline thing. But she wanted to have a baby with this mouse, and then she was going through a miscarriage, and they kind of had the joke of like, well, what happened? And the doctor's like, well, I don't know, maybe you angered a leprechaun, maybe you pissed off a Greek god. And when Claudia and I went to the doctor when we had a miscarriage, that was pretty much what they told us. That was about how that meeting went. She was just like we didn't ask. I mean, like, Claudia and I are warriors, so we had done a lot of research into like, well, like we looked up all this stuff and all this commentary. So we got to the doctor and we kind of knew that they weren't going to be able to tell anything to us. But sure enough, yeah, they were just like, yeah, we don't know. Like, we don't know what happened. You may have angered a leprechaun. You may have pissed off Zeus. Like, have you considered, like, did you do anything to piss off Zeus? I mean, who knows? Maybe you're bad people. I don't know. I mean, the doctor was actually much more sympathetic to that. She was very professional. She was very kind. The whole thing was less impersonal than the show went. But when you make a joke, to sum it up as a joke, I mean, deep down, that was kind of what the doctor was. That's all she could have really offered. It was like, well, maybe a leprechaun did it. Just like, leprechauns, man, I knew it. So yes, so we were just kind of like, man, that was about how that felt, wasn't it? I mean, the doctor was sweet to us, but that was about how that felt. Like, nailed that down. Perfect. So the whole Princess Caroline thing, the only thing I can say that bothered me about that one was just that she she breaks up with her boyfriend at the end, and I don't know, he was this really nice guy. I kind of wonder why he didn't call her again. Like, she was drunk, and then she left him while she was drunk, and I kind of wonder why he didn't call her again and try and reconcile things. And then she fires Judah. So that was just all kind of like sad. There was like, if I have a complaint, it's not that it was handled poorly, it's that I'm emotionally invested in the characters, and I'm really sorry. Like, I didn't want her to fire Judah. I didn't want her to break up with her boyfriend. I liked them as a couple. I really liked Judah. Like, I don't want these characters to go away. But that's part of what BoJack kind of is they do that. They have characters that are very likable, and then they leave because the other characters drive them away due to their personal problems or whatever. So that was all handled well. The Princess Caroline thing was good. That was a good one. And then meanwhile you had Todd, and Todd was a mix of really fun, really great, really liked him this season, and then also kind of like a little bit dull. They got a little bit wrapped up in his like asexual thing, where like Todd realized that he was asexual, and so he joined this like support group for being asexual. And the thing about like sexuality is that it's either going to be like really weird or it's going to be kind of dull, because I mean, when you get down to it, like, romance is romance, and if Todd finds someone who's like comfortable with him in this relationship or whatever, then it becomes a relationship, and the quality of it for storytelling really kind of depends on whether or not the romance is interesting, whether or not the couple is interesting. But just Todd being asexual is kind of not really, it's not a story unto itself. So him going to these things and him doing this stuff, it felt like it was just kind of like distracting. It was just sort of like, Todd is asexual, like Todd is asexual, and it's like, all right, like, let's get back to the clowns, because what Todd does is he has this like really fun thing that he wants to do, like this, he sets up this thing with Mr. Peanut Butter, where he's going to have clown dentists, because he's like, children love clowns, and children need their teeth cleaned or something. I can't remember the logic that he used, but the joke that they keep making is that clowns are not funny, and everything they do with the clowns is just absolutely hilarious. Like, the antics are so crazy. Like, all the little stunts that they pull, they're like, oh no, clowns, like, clowns bail out. Like, they have all these like crazy schemes to like make things work, and the clowns do all these like routines, and they're just like hilarious routines. So I just kind of love this sort of juxtaposition of everyone is like, clowns are terrifying, clowns are not good, clowns are scary, but then all the clown routines are just phenomenal. I just love them to death. And so finally, like, he realizes the clown dentist thing isn't working out, and he sets all the clowns free in the woods. He's just like, go free, clowns. And so all the clowns are like living out in the woods, and then the clowns, like, they catch rabies, and so then they're like zombie clown dentists. It's just like the worst thing ever. And so they come up with like the clowns who haven't turned yet. They all come up with like this scheme to like stop the other clowns, but it's like this wacky like zombie clown circus event. So like the clowns are like, like it's like this Rube Goldberg machine with clowns. It's just like I say, just these hilarious routines with these clowns. It's just a lot of fun, and then so finally Todd decides to turn the business. Like, he's like, oh man, I know what we'll do. It's like a jogging service. Like, there's this forest full of, like, zombie dentist clowns, and you run into the forest, and the zombies are slow, so you just run, gotta run faster than the zombie clowns, and man, that'll get everyone motivated to run, and everyone's gonna lose so much weight. And then it turns out that's, like, this really brilliant business plan, and it works somehow. I mean, like, you'd think it'd be super dangerous. But here's another thing that was weird, is they have this lizard from the Better Business Bureau come up, and this was another thing where I was just like again, like, you would let it pass, but they kept doing this throughout the season, where they just would have these things, and it was clear that they didn't know what this thing was, or it seemed like they didn't know what this thing was. So the Better Business Bureau showed up, and they were like, Todd, we are going to shut down your business because it's not a better business. And the Better Business Bureau can't do that. They're not actually a federal bureau. What they are is they're a privately owned group. They're like a non-profit kind of thing. And what they'll do is that if they find like a business is doing something that's unethical, like on a civil front, then they can actually gather together a bunch of people and perform a class action lawsuit. Like they'll look into other people who have been affected by this business, and they'll take this business down in court. So you can get this with like landlords are a really good example. So if you have like a notoriously bad landlord, what the Better Business Bureau will do if they get a complaint is they might look into people who are reporting that they're having problems with this landlord, that he's breaking these rules. And if they find like, here's these multiple violations, like everyone is having problems with this landlord, they might look into it and they might build a case against the landlord, and then they take him to court and they just clean the guy out, and then he gets shut down. Like they take action like this. This is kind of what they do. But like I say, they're not a federal bureau. They can't just like shut down a business. What they do is they could sue the business into non-existence, but if the business is not doing anything illegal, then there's nothing that they can do. So you don't really have necessarily a caseworker come out. One thing that they will do is they will actually contact people and say like, hey, I'm from the Better Business Bureau, and we're interested in your practices. We're concerned because we're receiving complaints, and they might negotiate, but yeah, they don't really have control over your business quite like that. Like, you don't have to cooperate with them if you want. And another thing they do is they keep track of businesses, like they give them ratings, but because they're a privately owned organization, like they say like, well, the ratings aren't always fair. There have been rumors of some people taking bribes to give good ratings to certain companies. And you always find that like the really big companies are like they're A+ rated or whatever by the Better Business Bureau, but that's because they're huge. And when the Better Business Bureau has a problem, they're just like, oh yes, no, we'll resolve it. But like for example, if you declared that everyone in your who used your business had to agree to an arbitration clause, I believe the Better Business Bureau would have a difficult time doing anything for you, because arbitration clauses right now, they're like this legal magic bullet where they say that you waive your rights to a class action lawsuit, and you're forced to just you have to arbitrate on your own independently against this big corporation with this judge for arbitrator, but the company chooses who the judge is, and so they choose someone who's like who preferences the company, and a lot of people lose the arbitrations, and so this is the thing that's going on right now. Better Business Bureau has a difficult time getting through that kind of thing. There's all kinds of things the Better Business Bureau can and can't do. But anyway, though, their whole thing is complicated. The way that they're depicted in BoJack is not really accurate. It doesn't matter. Like, it's not important, really, but it's just another thing that I thought was, like, weird, that they would specifically cite... Like, they would specifically bring up this, like, organization that really exists, but then just depict it, like, I don't know, incorrectly. It's weird. But at the end, though, Todd winds up hooking up with the Better Business Bureau lizard, because it turns out that she's also asexual. So she's just like, yeah, let's date, because neither of us want to have sex. So, yeah. The Todd stuff was great. Enjoyed that. Enjoyed the heck out of that. Lots of fun there. But then we got into Diane had this one episode, and it was really just kind of awful because it got really preachy. Basically, what they did, it was a gun control episode where, I mean, like you could just tell it was coming from the feminism angle, where they're like, women are in danger, and there was kind of that fear mongering of like, oh, like this guy approaches Diane out in the streets, and he's like, hey baby, you want some rape, and she's like, oh no I don't, but she has a gun. So then she writes this article about how like women should own guns, and she's viewed as like this, oh, you're like very progressive, you're very pro women or whatever. But it kind of didn't, like, she gets all these clicks and all these views because they depict Diane as being right again. Like, and then, like I say, they did this with the fracking too, where Diane's like, I'm anti-fracking, and then like the show just kept showing how bad fracking was in its own weird way. And so Diane's like, yeah, like women are in danger, women should be afraid, women need to live in fear. And the show's like, yeah, Diane's right, and it shows all these things. It showed like manspreading. Like, if you're not familiar with that, the concept of manspreading is like, how like guys, and I'll explain this, manspreading is when a guy spreads his legs out, like if he's sitting in a chair or something like that. And it went around the internet for a while as like a controversial thing, because they're like, yeah, when a man spreads his legs, he's subconsciously asserting his dominance over the female gender. And, down with it. It's just this weird, like, Freudian explanation. But the actual reason why that is because, men have testicles, and the way that this works is that because your testicles are on the outside of your body, they do need to be heat controlled somewhat. So they have a couple of different ways that they can be heat controlled. One way is that when it's cold, a man's testicles will actually ascend up closer to his body to try and maintain body heat. And when it's a little too warm, they descend. And of course, you opening and closing your legs affects the amount of air circulation. So if your legs are wide open, you get a little bit more air circulation, and it cools off your junk. And so guys will kind of instinctually close or open their legs depending on whether they're too hot or too cold. And so you find that some guys, if they're just sitting by themselves on the subway or whatever, they're kind of sitting on the subway, they might spread their legs out because they're just airing out their junk. I mean, it's just what guys do. It's part of how you regulate temperature. I mean, there's not really a lot of other ways that you can cool off. It's all our stuff, our equipment's on the outside. It's just how it works. So it's not like a weird like Freudian dominance thing, but it got passed off as this Freudian dominance thing on the internet. And so like BoJack was showing guys like manspreading, and it like made this woman uncomfortable, and it was like, oh, she'd feel so much safer if she had a gun. She'd be safe from the manspreading, and yeah. And then at the end of it all, what they wind up doing is like California bans all guns because women are starting to arm themselves. And I thought for a little while, like, because what BoJack tends to do is they stretch the rubber band out, and then eventually they let it go, and it snaps the characters in the face. And so, like, Diane was right, women should live in fear, women should be unhappy, this and that. And, like, they were stretching the rubber band, and then they came to a point where, like, Turtletop and the rest of the Hollywood guys were talking about, like, how to promote their movie, and they were like, maybe all this fear-mongering is a good idea. And I was like, there it is. There's the self-awareness. Because they were like, yeah, maybe if we promote our movies on the basis of like, yeah, women should live in fear. Like, this movie is pro-woman owning a gun, like, look, she's independent. She's going to shoot men. Like, yeah. And they start to like play this up, and they're like, yeah, it's a good idea. And then there's a mass shooting with a woman. And then they ban guns because everyone's afraid of, like, women having guns. And so the episode ends with Diane saying, like, well, California hates women more than it loves guns. And it was so weird because that was, like, the rubber band, like, they ended the episode, and the rubber band was still stretched out. Like, they didn't let go. They didn't ever ground themselves. They demonstrated that little bit of amount of self-awareness. And I thought that they were going to have, like, everything, like, Diane thought she was doing this good thing. And then it was going to turn out that she was spreading fear, and then, like, people who wanted to make money were going to use the fear to make more money. Because that's what really happens, that's how people, like, they're merciless, so I thought that's what was really going to happen, but then that's not what happened. And it was just weird, because, like, California, I'm pretty sure, has much stricter regulation than most places. Like, they have a very strong lobby for, like, tort lawyers there. So, like, if they can sue you for a thing, they like to keep their options open. Regulatory industry, it's strong in California. So I don't know why California, of all places, would hate women more than it loves guns. I mean, I guess they don't love guns very much, so maybe they just have I don't know. I don't know how that goes. And of course, like, you could talk about how that's a constitutional nightmare. But then again, so is having your governor lose his seat due to a skiing competition. So what can you say there? But it was so preachy and so weird. It was one-sided, and they didn't ground it. And it's kind of a red flag. It's a bit of a thing. It's a concern for me, because it means that somebody was able to actually, like, push that episode through and say, like, you know, all right, I have this agenda, I have this opinion, this ideology, and I want to express it. And then whoever's in charge of this whole process, however this all worked, it just so happened that this person was able to get all this through and get all this, like, sort of like this one-sided, like, ideological, you know, all this, like, weird stuff, this stuff with the manspreading. They got it all through. And if that person keeps getting things through, like, the show will get really preachy, and it's not going to be very fun anymore, because that was not a very fun, it wasn't really a very fun episode. It was just kind of dumb. But we'll end on a high note. What we learned a lot about in this season was about BoJack's mom, and this was kind of interesting. We also got into some of the feminist stuff there too, which was kind of unfortunate, but it was also sort of weird and funny. So again, it's like one of those things that's like passable because they tied it in with the storytelling, and it kind of worked in that way. Like, the gun thing didn't work. Like, it didn't really come back to be anything or mean anything. But the some of the stuff that they did with Beatrice, BoJack's mom, did work. Like, what you find out is that she lost her brother during World War II. Her brother went off to war and then died in the war, and this drove her mom, I guess, crazy with depression. I know, it just made her mom very depressed. So they decided to give her mom, like, a lobotomy. And like I say, there was some weird feminist stuff where they were like, here, eat some lemons with sugar. That's a good woman's snack, and things like that. They're just very hard on her about, like, what women should and should not do. And this is a little bit reminiscent of, I had someone on Facebook was talking about how, like, the patriarchy was telling them that, like, women shouldn't eat messy food. And I was like, who's the patriarchy? And she's like, these little old women that are at my church. Like, there was a big barbecue event at my church, and they said that women shouldn't eat barbecue. The patriarchy did this. And I was like, well, I mean, like, those women are really old, right? So if you think about it, like, back in the day, you didn't have all these, like, fancy electric washing machines, dryers, stuff like that. So if you got food, if you, like, spilled on something, then, like, your mom had to wash it out. And, like, dresses, you know, those nice Sunday dresses are notoriously difficult to clean the stains off. Like, a man wears his suit, and suits are a little bit more, you know, they're like dark colors a lot of times. You can kind of hide a stain with, like, a minimal washing. But, like, a nice white dress that you might wear to church on Sunday, like, man, that is a nightmare to get the stains out of. So I can imagine these little old women being, like, kids and going to church, and their mom saying, like, little girls don't eat barbecue. Not because little girls don't eat barbecue, but because little girls wear nice white dresses that are impossible to clean when they get barbecue sauce on them. And in the modern era, this doesn't really fit anymore. And so I explained this. I was like, I contradicted her. I was like, well, I suspect that probably what it was is that this was an old holdover from a time when washing clothes was a lot more difficult. And you know, I don't believe that this is a widespread belief. I don't think that this is a thing many people may have said, but certainly some mothers I could see would admonish their children for eating barbecue if their Sunday best was a white dress. And she goes, no, it was the patriarchy. And so again, it was kind of like one of those things. I was reminded of that when they were like, a little girl should only eat lemons and sugar. And I wish I knew what the writer was like, if the writer just came with that off the top of the head, or if this was one of these, like, weird things, like they went to a church and some old woman told them, like, you know, lemons and sugar or something similar to that, and in their heads they just didn't, like, they were like, yeah, the patriarchy, and they didn't really, like, think of the logic. But it was weird because I could see that kind of logic, so I got kind of a chuckle out of it, because I was like, there's some kind of obtuse logic here. I don't know necessarily where it comes from, but I get it. So Beatrice was like, only lemons and sugar. And it was kind of funny because you kept seeing, like, references to the lemons and sugar throughout the whole thing. So like I say, they wove it in, and as weird as it was, I mean, they made it work, and they made it part of the story. So, yeah, she has Alzheimer's, and she's just suffering, and she's going through all this stuff. Oh, right, and BoJack's daughter meets him. And I guess I kind of didn't really bring up BoJack's daughter because we really didn't do very much with her, or nothing terribly profound. They try to find her mom and everything like that. And don't get me wrong, she's a likable character. I kind of enjoyed her and her interactions with BoJack, but it didn't feel like the most profound thing that happened all that season. Princess Caroline definitely resonated with me a lot stronger than BoJack interacting with his daughter. It turns out at the end that it's actually not his daughter, it's his half-sister. His dad had an affair, and this girl that he hooked up, this girl that he meets is actually his half-sister. So he's like trying to figure out who her mom is, and they totally come up blank because BoJack can't find anyone who willingly had one of his children, and it turns out that it was his sister. So they look into that and they're like, who did my dad have an affair with? And then they're able to track down the mom, the proper mom. So they introduce his mom to his sister and all that. But his mom does this thing. She like puts like Adderall, I think, in the daughter's coffee, the girl's coffee. Shoot, no, I can't remember her name. Hollyhock. Yes, she puts like Adderall in Hollyhock's coffee, and then so Adderall, like there's a bunch of in earlier episodes they kind of hint that something's wrong with her, and then finally like it hits the wall and she winds up going to the hospital, and she's got like these 8 dads. They're like this like gay polyamorous like comedy bit. It's interesting. And it just so happens I was playing Grand Theft Auto San Andreas not very long. Like, I was like, man, I haven't played that game in the longest time. So I reinstalled it on my computer, and I was playing it, and there's this advertising for, like, my 6 gay uncles or something like that, or my 6 gay dads. I can't remember what the advertisement was, but it sounded a lot like what they did in BoJack. Because they had like all these different dads. There was one who was like the Fonz, and one who was like, you know, the artsy dad, and one who's like the this just all these different like weird things, and they speak in like gibberish or whatever. I remember like some people saying that they knew how to speak gibberish. It's a weird like language thing, but there's a trick to it you can learn. It's like Pig Latin. You know, basically they're all speaking Pig Latin because it's like their dad language. So it's like she has like these 8 dads, and they're all kind of this weird like part of a comedy bit, and that was sort of amusing. And the reason like I kind of almost wish that they had shown some of how Hollyhock grew up with like the 8 dads, because it seems so weird and funny. Like it might have been like really kind of neat to see them all doing their thing or whatever. Because the way that San Andreas pitched it is it was like this orphan girl. Yeah, this is the thing. Like Hollyhock is an orphan, and so she's adopted by these 8 dads. And it's like in My 5 Uncles or whatever in San Andreas, it's like this orphan girl is adopted by these 5 gay guys who I don't know. The joke was a lot more crass in San Andreas. It was like, what are you guys doing in the bathroom? We're flossing, you know. But yeah, it was like a more fleshed out kind of version of that same joke. I don't know if they were inspired by that, but I definitely caught the similarity when I played San Andreas again after watching this. But anyway, though, yes, they care about Hollyhock. They're concerned that she overdosed on Adderall, and they forbid BoJack from ever speaking to her again. But she is nearly an adult, so when she gets over the Adderall, she does call him, and you know, they figure out the whole like, well, you're my sister, not my daughter thing. And I don't know how that's gonna go. But it ends on a high note for BoJack. Normally, every season ends on a really low note for him. But yeah, first time in a while we have end on a high note for BoJack. So yes, like I say, it wasn't altogether bad, but there is writing on the wall that there's potential for BoJack to get really preachy and really dumb, because like I say, they did a lot of things that, or they did a fair number of things that didn't come across as like necessarily the writers omitting reality for the sake of comedy, but might have just been the writers not being aware of how things actually function. Like I say, with the fracking thing, the fracking thing was very political for a while, so it's possible that they were trying to make a statement and unfortunately just didn't know about fracking, really. Like, they knew what the internet felt about fracking, but they don't know this or that. And again, like the weird feminist thing with the gun, like it was just kind of like that's not really how those, like Diane getting tons and tons of clicks because she resonates with people, like that's how they depicted it, is they were like, oh, you know, this resonates with women, like so many women are clicking on this article, this is such a good idea. But I mean, we saw this happen where there was this feminist outrage thing, and I mean, it's still simmering. Like, there are still people who are really just like lethally furious about it. But what really happened was a lot of the clicks, it came up because of controversy. Like, people were viewing not necessarily because it resonated with them, but because they were mad, because the things being said were very sexist and very aggressive. They were accusatory. They were oftentimes not entirely true, you know, like the man-spreading thing, you know, like that was one that was a controversy that got spread around, because they were like, you know, it's a subconscious dominance thing, like they get into this like weird Freudian psychology, and so like people would want to clear the record, and they'd show up and they were like, no, it's not, that's not what like spreading your legs is not about dominating people. It's just a thing you have to, it's about temperature regulation. And then they would say like, you know, only a sexist would regulate the temperature of his balls at the expense of other people's comfort. And you kind of get into this of like, there's really no such thing as a people, like everyone's a person. So when you get into this like argument of like, well, some men are really inconsiderate, like some men are really inconsiderate, but like which men? Like which ones specifically? And I don't know, you kind of get into this sort of deal. It's like you can't just statistically identify like a demographic and then say like, based on statistical inference, you know, we need to crack down on like this gender or this race or whatever, because that's I mean, that's backward, that's bigoted, that's racist. That's not really how you need to approach problems. You need to understand that if you're seeing like politics is complicated, social politics is even more complicated. No one really understands sociology in a real way. It's still a developing science, as they call it. I don't think it's ever really appropriate to blame an entire demographic for anything. You should never do that, and it's unfortunate that there were a lot of people being celebrated as heroes for doing this. Especially lately, the internet has made it really easy for people to speak as though they represent a monolith of human experience, and it's just not true. You know, everyone's a little bit different. Everyone has their different spaces. Some people, some of these things would apply to, and some people not. But the problem is that it tends to be like what you call, it's like reverse epidemiology, where like epidemiology, if you know the cause of a problem, then you can go and you can look for it. If you find an illness in a societal group, like let's suppose that you have this huge outbreak of Campylobacter poisoning, you know, like food poisoning, and you want to figure out where it came from. Well, you know what Campylobacter poisoning is caused by. It's caused by this bacteria, which can be grown in such and such a place. And so you start looking at like who all was affected, and then you figure out like, well, did you all eat at the same restaurant? Did you all drink from the same well? Like, is there some, like, you know, the sources of Campylobacter infections, so you can actually trace it back, and then you'll figure out where the Campylobacter poisoning started. But that's because you already know the cause of the problem. If you don't know the cause of the problem, like if everyone just got sick with like a disease, and you were still in a primitive enough society that you thought like, I don't know, bad behavior would cause God to punish you by making you sick, then you might look around and you'd say like, well, what bad behavior caused this to happen? And you could look and you could say like, well, I think that watching TV is a bad behavior. And you'd ask all these people and you'd say like, well, you know, what, did you watch TV? And they would say yes. And so you'd find this commonality among this entire social group, everyone who got sick. You'd say like, oh, well, they all watch TV. Therefore, I conclude that TV has caused the Campylobacter poisoning, and we should abolish TV. And so you kind of get into this with social issues, where people sort of, they don't know what causes people to behave in the way that they do. They don't know if there's like, if you get widespread statistical data, it can be difficult to pinpoint why you're getting this data. And people with an agenda, or people who are just very foolish, will oftentimes come to a conclusion and then link a bunch of people to the conclusion and then say, there, that proves my point. And that's just not how epidemiology works. You can't do that. You know, it doesn't function like that. So you shouldn't. You never should. But anyway, yeah, the point is, we'll see. Hopefully BoJack continues to do well. I really like the show. I really want to keep watching it. Really want to keep enjoying it. It's been really good so far. It's been relatable. The characters have been really likable, really charismatic, and there's still open potential for them to keep going and to go into things. But I don't know. They may be running on. Who knows how many seasons they'll go. Like I say, the warning signs are there. But still enjoyed myself and everything like that. So, I suppose that'll be it for today. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll catch you all next time.